In this video, I'm gonna be sharing with you guys 5 tips to help you write a great podcast description to turn those scrollers into listeners. There are over 2 million podcasts out there, so just imagine how hard it's gonna be to choose one. Even if you're not completely new to podcasting, choosing the one to listen to is a pretty tough task. Sorry for the bad news, but even if your podcast is so unique and special in the eye of a new listener, it's just a one podcast out of so many out there. And if you don't convince them that it is special, no one else will. And the place that you can turn a curious guest into a loyal podcast listener is your podcast description. And as I promised in the intro of the video, today we are going to be sharing with you guys 5 tips to craft an effective podcast description. So without wasting more time, let's jump into tip number 1. Tip number 1 is about keeping it to the point. Apple Podcasts actually gives you 6,000 characters to summarize your podcast show. So it's around 600 words. But listen, no one is actually going to read 600 words. It's almost a full page. So the best decision is to keep your podcast description short and to the point. So you don't want to give out too much information to your potential listeners, and you still want to keep them interested in actually listening to your podcast show. Although we cannot give you like a specific character limit to follow, keeping your podcast description concise is a really good tip to follow. Tip number 2 is talk about the format. Your listeners are not only going to be interested in the topic that you're going to be covering on your podcast show, but also in the way that you are going to be delivering your podcast. Elaborate a little bit on the structure of your podcast show and the overall tone that you're going to be following on your show. Is it going to be like an interview format, or is it like a solo hosted show? So whatever format you follow, your listeners deserve to know that upfront. Tip number 3 is to remember who your listeners are. So when you're writing your podcast description, you need to know whom you're writing this for. Who is your potential listeners? What language do they prefer? Do they prefer to read like a formal description or more of a casual language? Having an avatar of your listeners is going to be really helpful here to guide you towards the direction that you want to take your show to. Tip number 4 is actually my favorite one. You ask why? Because it's all about keeping it personal. Talk a little bit about your personality. Most of your listeners are actually really curious to know about the person behind this show or the story that they had which pushed them or encouraged them to come up with this podcast show. So if there is an interesting story behind the creation of your podcast show, make sure to include it. And even if there is no story there, make sure your listeners actually feel how passionate you are about the subject of your podcast show. Last but not least, the final tip of the day is going to be showing your audience your podcast show's singularity. So what do I mean by that? You shouldn't forget to tell your audience what differentiates your show from thousands of shows out there. What is that one thing that adds charm to your show and kind of makes it stand out among all of those competitors out there? In other words, make sure to tell your audience why exactly they have to actually tap on that play button. Alright guys, these were our 5 tips in today's video to help you come up with a more compelling podcast description. Let us know if you had any questions about this episode, and even feel free to share your podcast description with us for an honest feedback from our team. As always, if this was your first time watching our videos, make sure to subscribe, turn on the bell notification, and if you found value in it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, not for us, for the algorithm. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. Until the next video, take care.